Welcome to Lived In, a podcast series by Hemby Home Co. Lived In is all about interior styling for the ordinary home. If you live in an ordinary house on an average street and you love design, this podcast is for you. Many of us long to infuse the places in which we dwell with both style and livability, but we also have to stick to realistic budgets. What does it look like to live in a space that transitions with you as life does? How do you build equity while creating a space that truly feels like home? And what can you do to make a space yours when it doesn't belong to you? Join me, Femi, a realtor, content manager, and interior advisor, and let's find out. Hello everyone, I hope you've all been doing well. I know it's only been 2 weeks since the last episode, but it literally feels like a month has passed. How are we already halfway through November? Don't even get me started on the countdown to Christmas. Anyway, one of the things I actually found in the last couple of weeks since we last were together was an article in House and Garden. And I don't actually currently subscribe to their magazine as I'm not in the UK, but I follow them on Instagram, and they shared a story about a man who basically overhauled some of the major rooms and spaces within his home with a budget of £10,000. And in the interview, he said, "We couldn't do anything structural. This was just for redecoration. Things like new carpet, paint, wallpaper, curtains, and blinds. I thought, let's see what you can do if you're judicious and spend wisely." And I just thought, well, that's a modest makeover, isn't it? The rooms they focused on were their bedroom and bathroom and study, but they also kind of very lightly touched a spare room, dining room, hallway, part of the kitchen, and the living room, just leveraging art and paint. So, genius. I've linked to the story in the show notes and on the website, and while there aren't before pictures, I still think that this interview goes a long way in showing how far a little money spent carefully can go. Big budgets aren't the only way to live beautifully. All right, let's get into today's episode. I've been thinking a lot recently about the fact that small spaces are a really common problem for people not building their own homes. So, people like you and me. No house plan is perfect, and when you inherit architecture, actually the Dear Alice podcast had an episode on inherited architecture a month or so ago, which I loved. I'll link it. But when you inherit architecture and you don't have a big budget, you are forced to work within the constraints that you have, which honestly I love. So for today's episode, I wanted to talk about how to address some of the common issues faced in small spaces. There are definitely challenges, but I think a good challenge is a great excuse for a clever solution. Without further ado, here's how to make a small space work for you. That wasn't supposed to rhyme. So let me begin by saying that a small space isn't in and of itself a problem. Small rooms can be awesome, just as big rooms can be absolutely terrible. So really what we're looking at in this episode is some of the challenges that we face in a small space. In my experience, there are 3 main challenges in small spaces. And you really could be dealing with all 3 or just 1 or 2. The main challenges are 1, a lack of storage, 2, little to no mobility, and 3, layout issues. A lack of storage is pretty straightforward, so it just means there is nowhere to put items that really need a home, like in a kitchen, your blender, or your Instant Pot. Little to no mobility is going to be felt in different ways dependent on the room. So in a kitchen, it could be that you can't open the oven and the fridge at the same time. But in the bathroom, it might be that you have to close the door in order to open the linen closet tucked behind it. Or that once you're inside, you can barely move around because there's so little floor space. The kind of layout issues I'm going to address are, I'd say, primarily in rooms that tend to have freestanding furniture, like a bedroom or a study or an office. But there are layout issues, the most expensive kind, that are also found in bathrooms and kitchens, rooms with really expensive fixtures that are costly to move around and costly to replace. Now, I mentioned 3 challenges, but there is kind of a 4th challenge. I don't think it really fits in this episode. It's the challenge of how a space feels or is perceived by the eye. I think that this matters, and it's actually one of the coolest things about design, the fact that it can impact the way you experience a space, not just the way you physically move through it. However, This episode is about solving tangible problems, so that's where I'll stay for now, and maybe we can talk about how design impacts our experience in a later episode. Now, once you've identified the challenges, or the challenge if it's just one, you need to move on to identifying the needs that you have. So, in my opinion, there are three main types of needs. So we've covered three main types of challenges, and there are three main types of needs. Some of these will overlap. That's not a bad thing. They are, number one, storage needs, number two, spatial needs, and number three, infrastructural needs. Storage needs are what needs to go in there and how. Does it need to be on show or not? So, for example, do you want the toilet paper on display in your bathroom, or do you want it hidden away? Something my husband comments on with the toilet paper in a bathroom is actually that I want it out of sight because I think it's an eyesore. He wants it in a place where guests can easily see it so that if they run out, they don't panic. Very curious as to your thoughts on that. Spatial needs. What do you need to be able to do in the small space? Do you need room for a wheelchair? Do you need to brush teeth or tap dance? Which way does the door into the space open? Those are the spatial needs. Infrastructural needs. These are basically when you ask yourself what physical structures or fixtures need to be in the space and who do they need to be able to cater to? Who is the space for? Does it need to potentially support the weight and activities of a tiny human? Does the toilet need to be ADA accessible? Those are your infrastructural needs. So basically, you're identifying the problem or the problems, figuring out your needs, and then you're ready to start considering them both in the light of the specific room or space that you're dealing with. Now, of course, there are some general suggestions for how you can make a small space more functional, but really to come up with great fixes, you have to be room specific versus having a blanket approach. Let's start with a tiny bathroom because I have experience here. First, you have to think about what type of bathroom this is. Powder room, primary bath, shared bath. Storage needs, generally speaking, in a primary bath or a shared bath are going to be greater than in a powder room. And layout and mobility are going to matter more in the shared spaces because more stuff is in them and they are designed with the potential to be used by more than one person at a time. So think about what doesn't work. If you need more storage and can't squeeze more in, I love the idea of delegating items that aren't needed all the time to other rooms. Maybe just keep 2 extra rolls of toilet paper in the powder bath and keep the 18 pack in the laundry room or in the garage. Mobility and layout can be really challenging in bathrooms because there are certain fixtures that just are required. Like at the very least, for it to be considered a bathroom, it needs to have a toilet and a sink. Now, there are still things you can do. Go for smaller scale fixtures, for example, although you need to be wary of this in rooms with really high ceilings. You can choose wall-hung fixtures instead of those that take up more floor space. You can hang shelves. You can make use of ledges and niches. And if you can afford to swap a tub for a shower, go for it. But note that ability to execute is going to depend on exactly what your space looks like, what your ability is, and the budget that you're working with. When we were doing our downstairs bathroom, I considered doing one of those showers that they can replace in a day. But in the end, I felt I was compromising on style at way too high a cost. So if that's you, just go for a sleeker tub or focus on the other elements if you can. Public service announcement that nobody asked for. I hate those tiny sinks that your hands can't fit in. What's the point? How am I supposed to actually wash my hands? My thing of the week this week is the Peekaboo Acrylic Rolling 2 Shelf, which is such a weird name for an item, CB2. Thank you. It is a 2-tiered shelf on wheels. It's clear perspex or clear acrylic. And I love that it's clear because it means you can move it easily from room to room and it will kind of fit in with whatever other furniture you might have. Its limited time price is $319.20, which is also a really weird amount. The regular price is $399, so that's a saving of $100 if you buy it now versus later. All right, let's get back to the episode. In In this week's episode, we're talking about how to tackle some of the challenges of small spaces, and we're about to get into bedrooms. I was actually trying to think in preparation for this episode about the smallest room I've ever slept in. And honestly, even though growing up I shared a bedroom at some points, I think I've always had fairly generous rooms. That said, I'm still familiar with smaller bedrooms, and storage, room to relax or play, and adequate space to walk around and negotiate furniture are going to be the biggest challenges in a small bedroom. If you're doing a modest makeover, or even if you're not and you're just trying to minimize cost, then the size of the closet, for example, is something that you can't really change. But you can maximize use of the space in the closet. Think about verticality. Think about storing the items that you access the least at the very top of the closet. If you don't have a closet connected to your room or as part of your room, which is very normal in Europe, if you can afford to do it, go for a custom closet or a customizable closet system, like the ones that they offer at IKEA. In terms of clearing visual clutter, you should limit what needs to be on your nightstand or bedside table or inside of it, and put as much as you can inside the closet. And then when you're choosing a freestanding closet, choose one that is shallow. Minimize closet depth to the most practical depth possible in order to minimize the footprint in the room, and go all the way to the ceiling if you can. Sometimes people are dealing with a lot of windows and not a lot of wall space in bedrooms, and so if you have limited wall space and you're wanting to save that for the bed versus the closet, then go for something like a dresser that has a lower profile and is low enough to sit under the windows, and then buy a bed that has space for storage underneath. In a bedroom, and the same can be said for living rooms, you have to think about the size and scale of your furniture. In a small bedroom, I'd advise minimizing the amount of furniture, but going for appropriately sized furniture. So don't go for a bed and 2 armchairs and a sideboard and a coffee table and 2 nightstands. Simplify. Pare it back. Go for maybe just a bed with floating incorporated nightstands, a bench at the end of the bed or a love seat, and then a sideboard for storage as needed. Once again, if you can go custom, then go custom on a bed. This might actually be really ideal if the space you're working with is awkward architecturally. For a small bedroom, don't follow rules just for the sake of following them. This is, technically speaking, general and not necessarily specific to bedrooms, but still, in the bedroom, if you need to, block the window, put the bed in front of a bookcase. If this improves the flow of the room and the visual experience of the room, you'll be able to move through the room a lot easier, which solves the mobility problem. And it's going to make the room feel bigger, which is an added bonus. Paige Wassell, who I adore, always advises against putting furniture in the corner. Nobody puts baby in the corner. And I do agree with her, but I think in a small bedroom, if you have to push it against a wall to make the mobility better, then go ahead and make a nook around it. Embrace the challenge of it and make it really cozy by making it intentional. You can use a bed skirt to hide underbed storage out of sight, which is also an added bonus. Bedrooms are honestly just so much fun, so set yourself free from constraints and do what you can to make it make sense for you. Let's talk about kitchens. Full-on kitchen renovations cost a lot of money. So focus on needs and then focus on budget, because this is really going to dictate what you can actually do. Smallness issues in kitchens are typically felt in 3 main ways: counter space, storage space, and then mobility/layout. So can you open the fridge and the oven at the same time? There's also a bonus issue, if you will, which is where do we eat? And that's going to be a common problem in a kitchen that doesn't have a separate dining area or a designated dining area. But let's get back to those main issues of counter space, storage space, and mobility/layout. So if the main issue is counter space, there are 2 things you should do or you could do. The first is to revisit your storage system. Make sure that you have the space that you need to store things that you don't use every day, like a toaster or a blender. In a lot of family homes, one of the things clogging countertops is actually paperwork. It can be really helpful to create a system that's easy to follow. Maybe you set a time every month in your calendar and you visit priority paperwork so it doesn't pile up, but deal with your systems. The second thing you can do is consider adding meaningful additional counter space. If you have a small kitchen without an island, consider adding an antique butcher block island. I'll include a few links in the show notes. They're square and a lot smaller, so they take up less floor space than the average island, but then you have a built-in space for chopping vegetables, for example. If there is additional space where there's no cabinet and countertop, you could slot the butcher block in there, or you could slot in a cart or something on wheels. I love the idea of a coffee cart or an appliance cart with your Instant Pot and your blender and your coffee machine on it. Continuing on with counter space, you could also hang things to get them off of the counters, and really just hang anything that you can. Pots and pans, silverware, cutting boards. Think outside the box and hang what you can. Finally, if you have a combination dining room, then embrace that space. Use your dining table as extra counter space. Why not? So that's counter space issues. Let's talk about storage issues. The first thing I'd advise would be to make sure that you are actually capitalizing on all the vertical space. So go all the way up to the ceiling if you can. The second thing I would advise would be to, just like with the counter space, make sure that you reassess the things that you have in cupboards and cabinets that you no longer need. One of the benefits of things like spring cleaning is that you get to see what you have and get rid of things that you don't need. So make it a yearly practice. If you've gotten rid of things that you don't need and you are still lacking space, think about moving the things you use less outside of the kitchen. And I'll touch on this a bit more in just a second. The third thing you can do, and this is again similar to solving the counter space issue, that is mount things on the wall that you can display to make room to store things that need to be hidden. And the phrase need to be hidden is controversial almost. I posted last week on socials about how the Swedes do this. Don't feel like all of your stuff has to be hidden away. Something I think is extremely impressive in, yes, Swedish houses or Swedish apartments, and you see it a lot in New York apartments too, the small ones, is things are just out and it's okay. Don't feel like for you to have actual storage, it means it has to be hidden away. I think that one of the challenges of a small room is that wall-to-wall and ceiling-to-ceiling cabinetry can make it feel like the walls are closing in. So have some open shelving. Maybe display your silverware, plates and cups. Let them all have a moment. Don't feel like you have to store it all behind closed doors in order to have useful counter space. Put things on top of shelves, put things on top of cabinets, put them on carts. Get them out of the way, but don't feel like they have to be hidden. Lastly, for storage, and I kind of briefly touched on this in terms of moving things outside of the kitchen, don't be afraid to borrow space from other rooms. Store things in the dining room if you can, or use sideboards to hide bulky appliances that you rarely use. So if putting your Instant Pot on top of the cabinets isn't an option, put it inside a sideboard in the dining room. Nobody will know that inside your sideboard in your dining room, you're hiding your Instant Pot and your blender. They're just going to be in there, tucked away, and then when you need them, you can get them. The last challenge a lot of people have when it comes to space in small kitchens is mobility. That is typically a more expensive challenge or problem to solve, and that's because mobility solutions are so specific to the particular kitchen, and they're usually something to do with how the kitchen is laid out. So oftentimes you see in these TV shows, somebody can't open the oven and a cabinet door at the same time. That's really frustrating. That's not their fault. The layout was not done correctly. So just be aware that those can be really challenging and expensive if you're solving them permanently. There are some workarounds. So, for example, a cabinet that is opening into the oven, can you switch the hinges to the other side so it opens the other way? Or could you replace the front with one that recedes into the cabinet? Those are some solutions, but really specific solutions are going to be your friend in that kind of situation. There's only one more main room I'm going to focus on in this episode, and that's the living room. After this, I'll touch really briefly on miscellaneous rooms. So for the living room, space and mobility are going to be the main challenges of this space, and then maybe storage, although I feel like this is less of an issue in living rooms versus bedrooms, bathrooms, or kitchens. So let's focus on layout. I think layout is the main thing people get wrong in a living room, and in a smaller living room, it's all the more crucial. Think of your space in terms of zones and use. Is it often a pass-through room? If so, the setup really needs to support that. Is it basically a room for kids to play in? If so, where do the toys go? That would be a storage issue. Is it connected to any other rooms? How are those accessed? Choose your furniture and arrange your furniture with the use as your starting point. Break the room into zones. So a zone for sitting to have a conversation, a zone for playing, a zone for working, that kind of thing. Depending on exactly how small or large the space is, your living room might really only be one big zone with one or no additional zones, which is fine. My living room comprises of really one main zone where we sit and host and read. We don't have a TV in our living room, which is controversial for some. And then we have a kind of outside perimeter, which we use to access other rooms or other areas. So the inner U-shaped zone hosts all of our main furniture, our seating furniture, our coffee table, that kind of thing. And then the perimeter zone hosts really only storage furniture that doesn't need to be readily accessible. So a bookcase or a sideboard, that kind of thing. This leads me on to my next point for layout challenges in small spaces. And I know that when you live in a small space and you're looking at it, this feels very counterintuitive, but just trust me. Don't put furniture against the wall. If you can help it, don't do it. I know in galley living rooms this can be tough because people like to maximize seating by putting it against the walls, but try not to. Even in a narrow room, selecting the right size of furniture and laying it out close enough for people to have a conversation is going to look so much better than furniture all spread out on the four corners of the room. People lay out furniture, but then it's like, well, how are you communicating with the person who's on the back wall when you're on the front wall? Are you yelling at them? Think about that. You also can, much like I said with the bedrooms, you can put a sofa in front of doors. So you can put a sofa in front of French doors or sliders as long as it isn't backed right up against them. Leave room to walk behind the sofa. Think about our outside perimeter zone. And if you have French doors, make sure they open outwards, which I think they should do for being an exterior door. And again, I've slightly touched on this earlier, but for furniture, make sure you think about the size of the furniture that you're using. This can be really challenging, but basically a small room doesn't have to mean tiny furniture. At the same time as, you can't have a giant sofa in a small, short or narrow room. That's not going to work either. Scale down the type of furniture, or if you can afford to, build custom furniture versus going for tiny versions of furniture, which is supposed to be large. So if, for example, you can't fit a full-size 3-seater sofa, don't get a miniature 3-seater sofa. Maybe just get a love seat and then have an armchair instead. Also, think multi-use when you think of furniture. Could the ottoman double as a coffee table or vice versa? Could a chair used for a desk also work for hosting friends for a game night? If someone is making it custom for you, then you might be able to get some really nice multi-use furniture. All right, what are the spaces we haven't really gotten into? These are what I call the miscellaneous spaces. The laundry room, the mud room, the office, the playroom, the butler's pantry, the dining room. It is possible to get really specific on these, and I would advise you to do so. But for the sake of not boring you for 30 minutes, think vertical and use the ceiling for storage. This is just some general advice for all of them. Think vertical and use the ceiling for storage. Utilize dual-purpose furniture like a folding desk, furniture that can be hidden away like a folding chair, and go for wall storage instead of floor storage whenever you can, as this visually tricks the eye without changing the footprint of the room. And that helps mobility. It is possible to make your tangible experience within a space less claustrophobic and more spacious. It just requires thinking outside the box a bit. I'd love to hear what small spaces you guys are trying to figure out in your homes. Send a DM on Instagram or email us at hello@hembyhome.com and send a photo of your space. I promise there is a solution, you just haven't thought of it yet. I've included some example images on the website, broken down room by room, and I think these will really help explain some of my ideas. Well, that's it for this week's episode. If you want more help on spaces in your home, I've included the link to our design services page where you can request help tackling specific rooms or spaces in your house. I work with both renters and owners, and after each consultation, clients receive a booklet with layouts, inspiration images, and a prioritized list of items and projects, along with a suggested budget. Thank you all so much for joining me on today's episode. For our next episode, we're going to discuss things to think about when you're house hunting. It's a great episode for first-time home buyers. That's it for today. As usual, our next episode will be available in 2 weeks' time. Until then, take care. Bye, guys.